So this blind tasting class 3. Everyone is on mute. Wanted to remind us, of course, today we're doing 2 white wines, no red wines until next week. So just wanting to ask if there are any questions or anything that has been troubling you, whether it's in a workshop from the past 2 or in the course of your life with blind tasting in the last 2-3 weeks. Is there anything that you can think of on the white wine grid that still is giving you trouble? So we're looking at the Master Sommelier Diploma white wine grid, and we're looking at appearance, nose, palate, initial and final conclusion. And so I'm just curious, if anyone has anything that they just really don't understand. Sometimes they're tasting wine and they really can't understand acidity, or they don't understand sweetness and how to detect it. So if there's anybody that wants to unmute and tell me, I'm having success with this, or I still find I don't understand this concept, please let me know. I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, well, I wanted to introduce, while you think about it, I wanted to introduce one other concept. It's really true in white wine and white wine only, and it's not really on the sheet here of the grid, as we call it, but as you take various diploma, whether it's WSET, Master of Wine, Master Sommelier, if you're desiring to take exams, sometimes we talk about brilliance in wine. So we'll look at a white wine and we'll say this white wine is dull, meaning it does not reflect light very well, or the extreme opposite being this wine is brilliant, almost as if you could look through the wine, look at the wine and see your reflection. And you could almost like put your, you could put your lipstick on from the reflection of the brilliance. So it's the way that the wine reflects light. I just wanted to point out that it's not clarity. So clarity could be something different. I'm gonna look at the chat because I see a comment. Okay, we'll talk about Brett Great in a second. So back to the clarity, clarity would be if a wine was not fined and not filtered, then you would see almost like a hazy characteristic, right? So that can probably be more evident if a wine is cloudy or not clear in red wine, unfined, unfiltered red wines. Sometimes that's how I tell the difference between Old World and New World. Again, a very broad stroke generalization, but if I'm drinking Old World Pinot Noir, tends to have a little less clarity of color. If I'm drinking New World Pinot Noir, especially some of the producers that are more on the modern style, it'll be very clear. So that's one characteristic that we talked about in the past. But what I'm referencing now and adding to our grid, we can even write it in, is the idea of brilliance, light reflecting off the glass. So the thought is the lower the alcohol, the more brilliant the wine is. So for example, next time you're drinking German Riesling and you're looking at an 8.5% Mosel Riesling, which they tend to be the region that have the lowest alcohol. So we call it the Anbaugebiet. The Anbaugebiet of Mosel is relatively low in alcohol, as we find them light and have residual sugar usually. Those wines are the best example of brilliance in a white wine. They reflect light very highly. So you see the light, you almost can see your reflection. A good example of a wine that might be dull as it relates to this star bright, brilliant characteristic in wine would be like a California Viognier. If you've ever had Viognier from California, they tend to be 15-16% alcohol, some California Chardonnays too. And the way that they reflect light is not as as brilliant. So they appear dull in color, almost like if you had your gold wedding band and it was just a little bit, it needed to be shined. So I wanted to point that out because I find that helpful in picking out alcohol before smelling, before tasting. The more sensory memory we can have, the better. With that said, let's look at wine number 1. If you have the white wine that we sent in the pack, and you can just reference the brilliance. We do in Masters, we have brilliant being the most bright. We have star bright as a characteristic. We use that term. We do day bright, and we do sort of dull. So, I mean, we can even keep it to 3 for this purpose, say dull, brilliant, star bright. You know, how much does the wine reflect light? So with wine number 1, does anyone want to tell me what they see? And maybe it's somewhere in between. So we're trying to determine just what brilliant of the wine is. I would say maybe in the middle, it's not brilliant and not dull. So bright characteristic. The alcohol, it's hard to tell, but we'll go through that again. And if anyone wants to look at wine number 2 and tell me if the brilliant, the characteristic I'm describing is a less or more than wine number 1. So I have some, what do you think? I see MJ's mouth moving.
I think it's less brilliant.
Yeah, with wine number 2, it looks like it's a little more dull than wine number 1. So perhaps we'll check in on it in a bit, but perhaps that has a little more alcohol. I tend to think they're roughly the same, but yeah, it's true. So just keep that in mind. Well, I have one comment that something that we're struggling to find in wine from Charles is the idea of Brettanomyces in a wine. And before you go through the grid, how can you determine it's not a wine from a warm climate or someone experimenting with that? So I want to tell us that Brettanomyces is, it's technically listed as a flaw. However, most people say it's only a flaw if it's a very high level of Brettanomyces in a wine. So we do list it that way. Brett is a yeast. It's a type of yeast, it's Saccharomyces yeast. And it was first, I guess, discovered as its own strain of yeast in Belgian ale production. So it really is a yeast that when you have it in a winery, it multiplies because it is a yeast very quickly. And so extreme amounts of Brett in your winery or in your barrel room or in your environment can become overgrown, if you will. And that will make a wine, anything subtle, anything dynamic, anything complex, just feel clobbered by the Brett yeast. So there are regions that are associated with this yeast maybe being more evident, right? Bordeaux, the relatively rustic old world wine producing region, places in France like the Loire Valley and Cabernet Franc. Brett is a part of their winery, so I don't necessarily think of it as a fault, but you'll start smelling things like a little bit gamey, a little horse stable, but it won't be necessarily a flaw. So you might be able to pick it up as like a little funk, and like, you know, a great example would be there's a producer of Cabernet from California that's known for their Brett, which is Cane Winery, and they always smell funky, but in a clean way, not in a flaw. It's only when it becomes like Band-Aid, like some Pinotage, and a long while ago, a lot of Long Island wines had like this really strong sense of Brett, but not necessarily in a characteristic that added, an interest. More like it became overwhelming. So there are wineries that are so paranoid. I always told this story about Brettanomyces that they won't even let you open one of those craft beers in the winery because they're afraid that the yeast from the beer would get into the winery and then affect the wine. So there's actually I can send everyone it, but there's a really great detailed, like, dorky thing I created about Brettanomyces and the different strains of it. So I'll send you that. So just keep it in mind, you don't really find it in white wine. It's really in red wine. And it's really in old world wine producing regions unless it's a fault. And then how do we determine if it's just a wine from a warm climate? But that has nothing to do with Brett. So we'll talk about warm climate because we're going to talk about ripeness of fruit. So we have characteristics that we haven't really talked about. It's not too dorky because there's not really a way to measure it, but one of the things that I want you to start thinking about is this concept of the condition of fruit. So how ripe fruit is. For example, we have these characteristics of underripe, ripe, overripe, cooked, and dried. So let's talk about underripe fruit as it relates to white wine. You'll know fruit is underripe because it'll also have high acid. So a wine like a Sancerre, a Sauvignon Blanc from France, will taste like lemon zest, lemon pith, and it will also have an effect on your mouth that makes your mouth feel like you're puckering. It's an extreme underripe fruit. And generally we associate underripe fruits with cold climates. So when I say Chablis has sour green apple, that's an underripe characteristic. It'll tend to be as well medium plus in acid. So underripe associate with cool climates, and sometimes cool vintages in a not so cool area. So you might get a sour fruit on the nose, but then when you taste it, you have more ripe or overripe fruit. So sometimes when there's a disconnect between the nose smell and the palate in terms of the condition of the fruit, it's like splitting hairs, but as you get, pretty good in the theory of it, that could be a good indication, oh, this is a cold vintage, but a warm climate. Or opposite. You might have almost like a raisinated flavor on the palate, but it smelled sour. So you can feel, oh, this is a warm vintage, but in a traditionally slightly colder area. So this is when it really becomes fun if you're, saying, oh, how do you tell the difference between, let's say, like a vintage like 2003 in France and 2004. Those are probably two of the best examples of back-to-back vintages where they were extremely different. Like Burgundy from 2003 would be cooked. It would have a little bit of a riper, almost a strawberry that was left in the sun. But Burgundy from 04, because it's colder, will have like a sour cranberry. So if a region is known to be a cold region and it has an anomaly in that it's a warmer vintage, that could throw you off, as you could imagine, right? So something to keep in mind. So that's underripe, the sour tart. A perfectly ripe fruit generally is a moderate climate or when things are even. So Napa Valley almost always has perfectly ripe Cabernet. So black fruit, blackberries, cassis, they don't really border on overripe, at least not these days. But you feel a sense that the fruit is at its peak ripeness. So ripe fruit is the type of fruit you want to eat now at the moment, right? Overripe fruit is when you start feeling like something is shriveling up. So you might imagine a blueberry, and you can imagine when you taste Zinfandel from California, it has this element of overripe blueberries. There are some grapes, which we can talk about a little bit more in the end. There are some grapes that do not ripen evenly. And Zinfandel is a really good example of them, where you might have an entire cluster of grapes that you pick, and some have It's called millerandage, or it's sometimes referred to as hens and chicks, but you'll basically have big berries and teeny little berries, or you'll have raisinated berries and green berries. So you'll have this characteristic that some grapes are raisinated and some grapes are sour. And as you learn about the different grapes and how they ripen, that might be a good marker. So in Zinfandel from California, we get blueberry jam and sour cranberry. That's always how I tell the difference between Zin, Shiraz, and Malbec, which are often hard to determine the difference. They're all New World fruity reds. So if I get an overripe fruit and an underripe fruit, Syrah and Malbec don't ripen that unevenly. So that's a good marker. So as we think about this, it's really important. We don't just say red cherry, we say cooked cherries. We have strawberries that are underripe that taste green, and we have strawberries that were left in the sun. So when we start to get into cooked fruits, you know, like you're taking a fruit and you're cooking it on a stove and you're making a preserve or a jam, again, these are indications of higher extreme climates. And then last but not least, when you start to feel dried fruit, it's as if the fruit is dried out. You could imagine like a fruit roll-up. That's as wine ages. So as wine starts off, it's primary, a juicy red cherry. When a wine becomes like dried cherries, like almost, you can't imagine the fruit anymore, that might be a good indication of, 5+ years of aging. So that's part of the class. And then as we look for more, I wanted to talk today about these characteristics that give herbaceousness in wine. And so this is an interesting thing. We've talked about this before, but we have a characteristic called pyrazine, sometimes pronounced pyrazine as well. And it's basically 2-methoxy-3-isobutene pyrazine. That's the full name. It's closely associated with the Bordeaux family of grapes. So we probably remember that Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc are the parent grapes of Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet Franc, Sauvignon Blanc, they created Cabernet Sauvignon. They're the parent grapes. They're the most extreme in pyrazine, I would say. Cabernet Franc for red and Sauvignon Blanc for white. So Sauvignon Blanc smells like, no matter what you do, some sort of green characteristic. If it's asparagus, cut grass, jalapeno, bell pepper. And Cabernet Franc is one of the most savory red grapes that we can find. So this real strong, almost like a red bell pepper, green bell pepper smell in a red wine. Cabernet Sauvignon has a little bit of that, but it often has so much power, so much oak, that you don't necessarily get it in a green way. You might sometimes smell it as mint, sometimes eucalyptus, and you really have to look for it. So it's not necessarily the best example of pyrazine, but it does have a little bit. That could be a good indication if you get sage, if you get something herbal, maybe in a little bit of a way that's why you go Cabernet Sauvignon, right? And pyrazines decrease after veraison. So if you remember, veraison is the point of which, if you're a red grape, the sugar spikes and the grapes actually turn red in color. So many times you can have a green herbaceous characteristic in red wine or white wine that is from pyrazines, but sometimes you can get that same green not from pyrazines if a grape is harvested underripe. So I'll give you an example. If you drink any red wines from northeastern Italy, you can sometimes find these like slightly green, almost like underripe green herbs, but that's not from pyrazines. Another trick that makes you think maybe it's Cabernet Franc or maybe it's an herbaceous wine is sometimes ladybugs, believe it or not. There's of course living, bugs and things all over grapes and vines. And there's a chemical almost secretion from the ladybug that can give you a greenness in wine. And specifically, I mention it because it happened in Burgundy, where there was, for some reason, a vintage where we had a ton of ladybugs. And as a result of that, the wines ended up having this 04 vintage specifically, having this really green aroma. So I'll tell you, the reason I passed my master's blind tasting was because I remembered about the ladybug vintage, because we had an older wine, which was 04 vintage Burgundy, and everyone called it Cab Franc. Everyone in my master's, after you left the room, we had people like, what did you call wine number 4? What did you call wine number 5? And it was like a very green smelling, light red colored wine. Turns out, a lot of people called Cab Franc because it smelled like that bell pepper. But the week before I had tried a lot of 04 Burgundies, and I remembered that. And so the tannins were much better suited for Pinot Noir. So I ended up calling 04 Pinot Noir from Burgundy. So just as an idea, it's important that some things trick us. Some things smell like one thing when they're really not. I'll give another example of pyrazines in white wines, of course, like Sauvignon Blanc from, let's call it Sancerre. It may not smell so strong with asparagus, but you get this little bit of like baby herbs, fresh herbs. And you say, oh, okay, that can be Sauvignon Blanc Sancerre. But in New Zealand, you get it in extreme ways, right? It just like almost jumps out of the glass like a jalapeno popper. And sometimes we can confuse lees aging. If you remember, lees are a characteristic that give like a chive or a sour cream potato chip smell in white wines. So you can find that might confuse you for Sauvignon Blanc when it's, let's say, Chablis or Muscadet that have lees. Okay, so does wine 1 or wine 2 have pyrazine? Which one can you tell me has the smell of a slightly herbaceous quality? Because one of them does and one of them doesn't. So probably wine 1 is the one that has the green herbal quality, but wine 1 also has a very intense aromatic, right? Almost like a tropical or guava or papaya. So you might miss a little bit of the green at first because wine number 1 has an explosive aromatic. So we would call that high intensity. And remember from a different class, we talked about something called thiols. If you remember, thiols was a characteristic that you find in certain grapes that makes it smell like lemongrass, guava, passion fruit. So with wine number 1, go ahead and imagine that exotic smell. So it definitely has that really, really ripe, like ruby red grapefruit and extreme guava. So it's sometimes hard when one thing is screaming and it's really intense for you to see the subtle, but there's pyrazine in wine 1, thiols in wine 1, and there's also a sense of something round in wine 1. So maybe something like lactones, if you remember from another class, when we smell something vanilla, clove, there's a roundness or a warmth to the wine that's coming from oak use. So lots of things going on with wine number 1. We'll formally go through it, of course, in just a second, but just wanting to point that out. Monoterpenes. This is the next characteristic that we're going to learn about today. Monoterpenes are the smell of florals. So maybe you'll smell wine 1 and wine 2, and you'll tell me which one do you think has monoterpenes. So wine 1 or wine 2? Yes, I think I see Josh saying wine number 2. And You're right, Crystal, as well. So on a scale of 1 meaning the lowest and 10 being the highest, if you had to tell someone that could not taste and could not smell, they had, unfortunately, the inability to taste or smell how floral wine number 2 is, what would you say on the nose? Does it smell like high floral, like extreme, or moderate, or low?
It's super floral.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Yes, super floral would be high intense. This is one of the most floral grapes that I could think of to show you, which is why in a class on monoterpenes, I had to include it. So there's a couple of different ways that you get flowers in wine, okay, but the whole broad characteristic is called terpenes. So you can say a wine is terpenic, you can say a wine is floral, a wine has terpenes. Anyway, there's a couple of them. So we have linalool, which is a slightly spicy, highly floral compound. And this is alongside with geraniol, some characteristic that sometimes shows like soap, or I've heard like grandma's perfume, or I've heard, you know, an extreme, like almost, yeah, soapy is a characteristic. If you were to do a perfume class, I did this really cool perfume class with a bunch of winemakers where we were able to smell actual real florals. And there's something called neroli, like so neroli, you can probably see it in a lot of women's perfume where you get orange and rose. This is the more specific floral that I'm getting in wine number 2. So you can imagine rose petals or really strong dried orange. This is a characteristic that you find in the following grapes. I'm going to name them a few of them. Muscat, called muscat, which we find in Alsace. We find it in Gewürztraminer, which is a grape we also find in Alsace and some in California. We find it in a grape called Torrontés. Torrontés is a grape that grows in Argentina. And Torrontés is actually a cross of the Muscat grape, the family of Muscat, with a grape called the Mission grape or Criolla Chica. So essentially, those are 3 for white grapes extremes. But some other grapes, we talked about it last week, that have a little bit of monoterpenes. Viognier. So somebody asked last week, how do you tell like the marker for Viognier? The marker for Viognier is, it smells like Chardonnay that flowers, Chardonnay with flowers. But it's not as extreme as this. Viognier tends to have a little bit of floral, but doesn't become floral. Another grape that you might see a little bit of floral, a little monoterpenes, is actually Albarino. So sometimes we get like, but nothing close to this. It's very subtle. It's lilies and almost a citronella smell, which is a characteristic that you find in Albarino. So that's how I tell the difference between Pinot Grigio and Albarino, because they have a lot of common ground. They're both neutral white wines, pale straw in color, but the citronella, like that smell of citronella candle that you sometimes get, are lilies in Albarino. And believe it or not, even though it's not as extreme as any of these that we're smelling, is Riesling. Riesling always has the teeniest smell of like a white flower, which is actually something that you might pick up after you get the petrol and the peaches and the apricots, but a little bit of that. So since this is a very high concentration wine number 2 of monoterpenes, this is one thing that you would want to definitely say right away. I smell high, intense florals. It's smelling like neroli, orange, rose petals, geranium. Sometimes we say lychee. It smells exotic. So love it or hate it, that's a very extreme smell. Alpha terpenol, which is a less aromatic terpene. This is something, it might smell grapey, sort of there's only like really one grape that smells grapey for white, which is Muscat. Sometimes you find that Moscato, right? You smell Moscato and you're like, oh, it smells like, Concord grape juice. So Muscat can be really high in alpha terpenol, which is not as extreme. So things to keep in mind. Okay, moving along, there's something called isoamyl acetate, which is an ester meaning something that smells, which is produced by yeast. At low concentration, it gives you a fruitiness. And often it's been associated with German wheat beer. It's one of the chemicals that you find in bubble gum. So it can smell, nobody really knows what this is, but pear drop candies. There are these candies that are made like to smell like pear drops. But when you smell this tutti fruity sort of banana smell, it's actually coming from a yeast. And you find it a lot in Beaujolais. And anytime a red wine is made with carbonic maceration, so to remind you, you take a whole cluster of grapes and you throw it in a fermenting tank and you close the tank up. The fermentation is going to make the berries and the clusters explode. And that characteristic of carbonic maceration, where you get a lot of color, but you have a very quick maceration, is a characteristic that they used a lot in Beaujolais. And it gives you this banana smell. So a yeasty kind of fruity. Some people miss Beaujolais in blind tastings because they think it's New World, because they think it smells like candy. But just remember that you can get candied fruit from New World wines, but you can also get that from this type of yeast. So banana and young smelling fruity wines, especially white wines. It doesn't only have to be with New World. It can get that way from this ester from the yeast during fermentation. And then something I found last night, I was tasting a wine and it was this smell, which is, it's technically, people say it's a flaw, but I think it's very important for blind tasting. Something called ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate is the smell of varnish, nail polish remover. In an extreme wine, it's a flaw, but almost always exists in Italian wine, especially reds. So it's a marker for me for Italian wine. It does smell like here, high tone. So you can confuse it with floral. You can confuse it with a yeast, but ethyl acetate is an ester from acetic acid and ethanol. So it's a combination bacteria that makes something smell like floral, but in a way that has a teeny bit of a tang. I don't know how to explain it, but more like a sour blueberry yogurt or something like that. If it's a small amount, and like varnish or nail polish remover or something more. But you find it a lot in Italian wine, and especially in reds. Something to keep in mind. We're going to go through our wines, but when you get this presentation, what I did is I took the major grapes and I broke them down and by region, and I gave you some characteristics that make them different from the next. So when you get this, I'm not going to read you the slides because that's a little weird, but as we're in class 3, I wanted you to have something tangible that would show you what can you expect from Riesling from the main regions of the world and how they differ. So we have German Cabernet wines. I put some Alsace markers for Alsace Riesling, and then the difference between, like, let's say Australian Riesling. We talked a little bit about this when we tasted that Clare Valley wine in the beginning, but just a little bit of a breakdown of the major white grapes. So you have Riesling, you'll see Sauvignon Blanc. So maybe we'll just take this example here of Sauvignon Blanc and talk through what the major regions are where Sauvignon Blanc is made. So in the old world, we have Sancerre and Pouilly-Fumé. People often ask, how can you tell the difference between Sancerre and Pouilly-Fumé? By the way, they're 2 villages. They're right across the river from each other. And it's very difficult unless you're like tasting a lot of them. But if you had to split hairs, you could say maybe there's a teeny bit of a flint or a smoke to poulet fumé that comes from some partial oak use. But in general, they're very similar. So they are almost always pale and medium straw color, have like a zest, underripe citrus, so like grapefruit pith, lemon, lime, very chalky. The soil is very white minerals. And the palates are generally light to medium bodied, dry wines, medium plus acid and medium alcohol. And when we're comparing, most people would say New Zealand stands out as being intense, much more intense, like jumps out of the glass, high aromatics. But when we do smell New Zealand, we get aggressive vegetal, lots of asparagus, green bell pepper, jalapeno. Generally, sometimes they can have a teeny bit of residual sugar, so they'll taste like a ruby red grapefruit, have medium alcohol, medium plus to high acid, which is somewhat tricky. And the reason everybody thinks that New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc should have low acid because it's newer worlds, but sometimes we have acidity added to the wine. And then last but not least, which we don't necessarily have here, is Sauvignon Blanc from California. And Sauvignon Blanc from California is something we want to keep in our mind because we don't smell a lot of it. And it has a little bit of both of those characteristics. Sometimes you can see some wood, oak use. You have an exotic smell because Sauvignon Blanc has a lot of thiols, those passion fruit aromas, and you get like a smoky, flinty mineral smell. So you're going to see later on, I just used that one as an example, but we have broken down the major regions where you find Chardonnay, and then I did the same with Pinot Noir and Cabernet. So why don't we go and spend a lot of time talking about wine number one? So I think it's helpful when you all can ask yourself a series of questions. So when you're blind tasting, if you have this wine or if you have any wine similar to it, let's all go through the site. And I'm not going to have somebody do the entire wine, but I'll ask you questions. And if anyone wants to jump in and say the answer, feel free. But so we have a clear white wine. And ask yourself, is it green, straw, gold, or amber? Wine number one. So which one is more green? And you can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Do you have some green? Do you have some straw, gold, or amber? And remind you when you have gold, is it age or is it coming from oak? So let's see, who do we have that wants to tell me the color? Maybe does Nicole? Nicole, do you have the wine? I forget. York?
Yeah, I actually, my wine appears to be a gold color.
Yeah.
And I was thinking maybe it comes from oak because I can smell a little bit of oak.
Yes, perfect. So exactly. So we have a medium or deep gold. So we can remember when we have this color gold that it's either age or it's oak or it's both. So the first thing you do every time you see gold from now on, everyone, for white wine, every time you see gold, your second follow-up thing should be, does it smell like it's a young, fresh wine or does it smell like it's an oaked wine? So when I smell this, I see gold and I say, it smells like there's some oak here. But it also smells like there might be some bottle age, some older characteristics too. So a lot of people say, Laura, how can you smell young versus something that has some bottle age? Just ask yourself, is it only fruit and fresh and bright, or does it have a little bit more, like the fruit is starting to dry out or it's not as juicy and fruity? So Crystal's right. We have a little bit of a darker gold at the rim. So can you understand how it's probably getting gold from a little bit of bottle age and from the oak, but just because when you smell it, it's not just a fresh, like, you know, clean 1-year-old Pinot Grigio. And so maybe you can see that the fruit is starting to dry out a little, in addition to being exotic. Okay, so that's one thing just to point out. So viscosity, you probably see about medium plus viscosity here. If you give it a nice swirl, you'll see that the tears are moderate to form and fall. No gas, no sediment. And the next thing we want to smell is the absence of flaws. So we're not getting any flaws here. But as I mentioned, the wine is not just this primary juicy, fresh 1-year-old wine. So I might look at and smell a little bit more dried fruit to start. But we already said this is very important. This is a super intense wine. So the intensity here, do you guys get medium plus? Like it jumps out of the glass and there's like layers of things going on. If we had to pick a family of fruit, would it be more orchard, citrus, stone fruit, or tropical? And this is very important. This is why we're gonna talk about this wine in particular. This is why we picked it. So what would you say? Maybe Nicole. Oh, I don't know if Nicole, the other Nicole has the wine. No, she doesn't. Does Nancy have the wine? Nancy Hartsock? I forget. Nancy, you have the wine? Okay, Nancy, if you don't mind, tell me which family of fruits do you want to rule out? Is there any fruit that any family that you think, it doesn't really have this fruit? That's helpful as well. Like,
I don't get any tropical.
okay, no tropical, great. Does anyone else have anything they think is an extreme in this wine? Anything you want to keep in?
I actually have a question on this wine because when I initially smelled it, I got more, I did get more orchard and a little bit of tropical. Like I got bruised apple, I got ripe pear, I got a little bit of passion fruit and something else that was maybe a little rounder. It might be kiwi, it might be guava. I'm terrible at my tropical fruits. On the palate though, and I know we haven't gotten to the palate, a lot of citrus kicked in. One citrus in particular. Does anybody else have that issue where they don't pick up citrus on the nose as well as on the palate? Or is that just a me thing? It might just be a me thing.
No, it's not a you thing, but I'm glad you brought that up. So I want to talk about this. Tropical aromas, Nancy, it's not that they're there and you're not wrong. But the tropical, the way we normally think of it from warm climates, hot climates, like there's not banana and there's no mango. Those are things that usually we find like California Chardonnay or Viognier. So I'm agreeing that in that regard, it doesn't smell like tropical. But the tropical that we are mentioning of passion fruit and guava, that is there. And it's not coming from climate. And this is why I picked this wine. That's coming from the fact that this wine has that characteristic of thiols. So that pineapple almost, or sort of the tropical exotic, that's there. And that is actually funny because it's an aroma. Thiols is an aroma you smell, but you never taste. So to Kelly's point, you smell a lot of that exotic fruit, but when it comes from the grape type and not from the climate, you will never taste it. So it's actually funny that you mentioned that you smell the guava and the papaya, but you don't smell it. You don't taste the citrus. That's a very key point of this wine. So, okay, so we almost would think it's from a hot climate by the nose. We would almost think it was like a different grape from the nose. Now, in terms of non-fruit, do we get a lot of minerals?
I don't get a ton of like minerality or funk or things that I would associate with Old World.
You're right. So forgetting like going to Old World, New World at the moment, but there's not a lot of chalk, there's not a lot of mushrooms, there's not a lot of minerals. So I could safely say that this wine has low minerality, low organic elements. Some of us didn't really pick up the herbs because of all these other things, but can you smell now a little bit of that green. In this case, it smells like a sweet herb, like basil almost, or like a baby. I always think about this wine in baby herbs. Like when you go to the green market in Union Square, and you get like baby micro arugula, or you'll get like a sweet pea tendrils. So it doesn't have to be like harsh green, but it has a little bit of like a minty greenness, or a sweet pea tendril. Those really like beautiful, like young, people would say young herbs. And then the spice comes from the oak. So you get that warming vanilla, cinnamon, kind of clove smell, a round smell. So there is some used oak and some new oak here. And as we mentioned, the wine has some age.
Did anyone get like straight up marzipan, or is that?
Yeah, like a nutty quality.
It was like the first thing I could smell before anything else.
That's great. I like that. I love that marzipan nutty, almost like the pinoli cookies, where you use that like hazelnut kind of paste or almond paste. Really good one. I love that. That nutty quality, and that's probably in this case coming from oak, and a little waxy smell as well. So when it's really exotic like this, I think I would automatically go to warm climate. But when I tasted it, that's when we get ripe citrus. So grapefruit zest, it's a little bit of passion fruit still. But I think you get the lemon and like fire lemon, candied lemon, lime zest, like almost like a rose's lime juice, like a candied lime. Anyone get any other? Yeah, maybe a little pear, but it's not really about orchard fruit. Ask yourself when you tasted the texture. What's the texture like? We don't spend enough time talking about texture in wine. Is it creamy? Is it more sour in texture? Like is it angular? What? Sometimes in MW, I feel like they do a really good job at explaining wine in shapes. So what is the shape of this wine? And so we get a little tart and a little sour, right? That's from the grape, perhaps. And what about any texture in addition to having that crisp tartness? Do you have any texture that reminds you of like something smooth, or is it only sour?
I think it starts off feeling really round and full, but when the acidity kicks in, it kind of blazes through that.
Great. Amazing. Okay, cool. So let's say we have a wine that has some new oak. It's a dry wine. And what's the body like for you all? Is it low, high, medium, plus?
Medium.
Thinking in shapes, it starts off round and it narrows. It gets fuller, almost like a decanter, like how you have the round and then narrow. So yeah, so I would say medium. Alcohol, believe it or not, is medium plus. You can't probably smell it, but it's like 14.5% alcohol. So it has a little bit more heat. If you exhale, sometimes I do that when I smell and taste a wine. I'll take a smell, and then after I swallow, this is a trick one of my friends does too. I go like just exhale, and you can kind of smell it. Or sometimes, if you just think about the center of your eyes, you can. I mean, it's not high. It's still a relatively moderate alcohol, moderate plus, but it's 14.5.
Wow.
Okay, so I think all signs point to New World because we have a little bit more of an explosive, intense wine. We have absence of minerality. We have probably a moderate to warm climate or a moderate to warm vintage, but the acid is, still nice. So probably a place where you can get ripe, warm days and maybe a little bit of a pocket of a cooler night. What are some possible grapes that you think of when you smell this? It's a tricky one. What is it? One of the grapes that I told you in the past is one of the most extremely aromatic with thiols.
Sauvignon Blanc.
Sauvignon.
Blanc.
Yeah. And so the reason that you're not immediately saying Sauvignon Blanc is because you probably have never had one with this much exotic smell.
Or oak. I've never had with this much oak.
Yeah, and that's exactly right too. And that's why this is an important wine to bring up in a workshop like this. But Sauvignon Blanc from Bordeaux, which we didn't talk about in the slide, but would smell like this too, but it would have a lot of gravel mineral. And this is a wine which is Sauvignon Blanc that's oak aged. So this is what happens when you introduce oak to an extremely aromatic Sauvignon Blanc type of wine. So we can say maybe 3 to 5 years old because we had some development, 5 plus, whatever you want to say, but definitely some age. And it's Sauvignon Blanc with barrel fermented. So actually, we can take a look. This is Robert Mondavi Fumé Blanc. I wanted to bring this because we don't drink enough Sauvignon Blanc. I wanted to have a conversation about white Bordeaux, even though this is not white Bordeaux taste. But Robert Mondavi Fumé Blanc, it's the reserve one. It's 2015. And it's a wine that has a little bit of Semillon, just a small amount, 5%. But all of it was barrel fermented. Its retail is like about $58. Female winemaker, Genevieve. You probably know the history of Robert Mondavi, founded in 1966. Now, some of the wines are big bulk. They make, of course, inexpensive wine all the way through premium wine, but it's one of the iconic producers of Sauvignon Blanc. They named their wine Fumé Blanc after Poulet Fumé, which is barrel fermented. And so I thought it was a really good example of Pyrazines, of Thiols, something to keep on your radar of Sauvignon Blanc when it's oak aged. And I would encourage you, if you can, to buy a white Bordeaux. We don't drink enough white Bordeaux in our lives. It's not white Bordeaux because it doesn't have the minerals, but the next time you have white Bordeaux, this is the smell of the guava and the pineapple and the passion fruit, and you'll just find a little bit more mineral, and that would be a good example of like if you want to try something new that drinks like white Burgundy for white Bordeaux, that is, not this one. But this is really delicious, and it's a perfect example of Thiols, Pyrazines, New World, Sauvignon Blanc that's not New Zealand. So keep that on your radar. Let's go to wine number 2. And let me make sure. When we always do that. When we look at wine number 2, I mean, we're almost, let's talk about the color of wine number 2. What is the color between straw, gold, and amber? How does this differ from wine number 1? So maybe, does anybody see like a little bit like, well, we should say the wine is clear, right? But it's gold. It's kind of like a goldish amber, or not amber, it's like a medium gold. Do you guys have any green hues?
Medium.
Okay. I know it's hard to volunteer. We have the same people, but what about like looking at the viscosity and the texture? Let's talk about that, because I often find these wines to be a little thicker. What are you looking at, Kelly? Tell us about the site.
Yeah, I forgot to peek at this when I had natural light. I have no idea what color this wine is, but I am getting a pretty high level of viscosity when I give it a swirl. So it does seem like it's going to be pretty thick, either from sugar or alcohol or both.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you look at the viscosity, we remind you guys that high viscosity can be high alcohol, or it could be a false positive where it looks like it's high alcohol, but it's because there's sugar. Either way, I think we could all look at this wine and say, this is high viscosity and a more like a true like straw gold. What do you think about the color, MJ and Josh?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit, maybe slightly lighter in color overall around the rim. But I think looking through it, it's about, I would say about the same in terms of kind of that medium gold.
Exactly. And sometimes in these wines, I will find a little more like deeper color, but this one is in the medium gold. You're absolutely right. So we have a medium gold with straw edge, not as gold in the rim like the one before. So perhaps this wine, one thing I want to point out is sometimes you get, remember when we see gold, we're supposed to say to ourselves next, is the gold from age or is the gold from oak? So smell the wine and tell me, is the gold from oak? No. So there's spice, but in the spice of gingerbread, this is not a spice of vanilla. So there is a spiciness from the grape, but this is not oak smell. And it doesn't smell old either. It smells very young. You can see the difference between the smell of a slightly older white wine with wine number 1 and this one. So actually the gold, there's one other thing that gives gold to a wine, and that's sunshine. So if you have a very, very sunny region, you'll sometimes get gold even without oak or without age. So I know what the wine is, but it's also, this is the golden, the little bit of a more lighter gold is coming from this actual region or the grape and not from oak or oxidation. So next, the nose. We talked about it. So do you see how both are extreme in aromatics? But wine number 1 is more like blockbuster, high tone, jumps out of the glass, like jumps onto your nose almost, right? And wine number 2, it is intense because you smell a lot of floral, but it's not extreme in terms of like an explosive high tone, right? So what do you think about the minerality or earthiness of this wine? Can you see like I want to remind you, like one of the things I do when I'm smelling earth or minerals, first I ask myself, is it more organic or is it more inorganic? So does it smell like stones or does it smell like something that was once alive? So if you had to pick mushrooms or rocks, which one would it be?
Rocks.
Yes, you would be right. And then if you had to pick from rocks, and you had to pick white rocks, gray rocks, and black rocks, this is how you get better at minerals. You don't have to choose, granite or graphite or volcanic ash or marl. But which one is it more? Is it kind of like a warmer earth or a black earth or a rock?
Rock.
Yeah, so some rocks, some gray and white rocks, right? I think that's a good thing to say. Like we don't get super cold soil, but we don't get warm soil. So gray and white rocks, that's great. Okay, and what we know is floral. It has the neroli, it has the rose petals. What kind of fruits do we get? When we push the minerals aside, what kind of fruits do we get? So the condition of the fruit. First, is the condition of the fruit overripe, cooked, or dried?
I think overripe.
Yeah, almost syrupy, right?
Yeah.
If you took a pear that and you poached it in like an eau de vie, like it's so you have like it's not candy, but do you see it has like a dried, like almost an overripe or dried fruit. So lychee would be a really good descriptor. If you ever have lychee, they usually come in a can and they have those syrupy juices around them. But also there's a bitterness to the fruit too.
Okay.
It smells almost like when you eat a peach pit and you get the ripe peach, but also the bitterness. So there's something what we haven't really discussed in white wine, which is called phenolic bitterness. The feeling almost like of a tannin in a white wine, like something that pulls on your teeth, or it feels like almond. So do you guys, you can smell it, but when you taste it, ask yourself if you get any sort of like tea-like pulling on your teeth. Okay, so we have a little bit of those candied, lychee, any other fruits. It's a lot of floral and almost like floral water. If you ever accidentally leave those flowers in water too long, now it has like that green, like funky flower water.
Mhm.
Anyway, very strong characteristic from Old World. No,
Yeah, I was getting like, I don't know, like orange blossom or like almost honeysuckle in the very beginning. And I think from the like sugary sweetness.
I got that.
and you think it's going to be sweet, right?
It may, yeah, I mean, I haven't tasted it yet, but it gave me that impression.
Exactly, like almost like that syrupy sweet.
Yes, therapy, yeah.
Yeah, the neroli, the orange is absolutely there. I definitely get that honeysuckle and that smell as well. Okay, great. So we know we have a relatively youthful wine with no oak, and on the palate, put the wine on the tip of your tongue if you can. Remember, you taste sweetness on the tip of your tongue. So tell me, does the wine have residual sugar?
Yep.
Yeah. So we definitely have the little sweetness at the tip of our tongue. Do you feel the phenolic bitterness, the grip? You can almost see it in your guys' mouths because you have this sweetness, but then when you look at you guys, you're like a little bit of that bitterness as well. Like an orange skin, orange zest. Okay, great. So on a scale of sweet being dessert wine and dry, of course, it has residual sugar, but would you call this a dry wine still? No. So just keep in mind when you're doing these kind of tastings, you don't want to say it's sweet. You would say the wine is off dry. It has residual sugar. So there's a sense of residual sugar, but you don't call it a sweet wine. And I know it's splitting hairs, but that's like what you would call Sauterne, or that's what you would call like a very unctuous, like a wine that would be considered like a late harvest. So this is a off dry wine. That's fair. What's the body of the wine? Very important. And also acid. The real reason this is what it is because of that acid. So it's hard to taste at first because you have to adjust because of the sweetness, but there's a bitterness, but it's low acid grape, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you feel the sides of your mouth is not necessarily, I mean, it's balanced for sure, but I would say medium minus or medium acid. So the acid is one of the reasons it's not Riesling. Riesling would never have this low acid. So, okay, so medium minus acid, medium plus body, the glycerol of the sweetness plus the body of the texture is giving it a medium plus body, maybe medium plus alcohol, and the bitterness of it's balancing the sweetness. So, okay, so what do we think we think we have to say Old World, right? Yes, somebody saying sounds like Alsace Gewürztraminer. So, okay, great. This is a climate that is actually warm. A lot of times we think about it as a cool climate, but it's actually very warm. It's a lot of sun. It has the rain shadow effect, so it has a moderating effect in this region that makes it warmer than it should be. But we have a wine that's young, so 1 to 3 years old. And then probably the question here is what else could it be? So somebody said Gewürztraminer, which is a grape that has lychee and has rose petals and has lanolule, the floral, and has spice. It's absolutely perfect for Gewürztraminer. But just for argument's sake, let's put the other grapes in here that belong. So if we're saying Gewürztraminer, we should be saying the other grapes that are noble for Alsace. We could say Riesling, but we would want to rule that out immediately because it's too floral and because it has no white peach, no apricot, no the main reason it's not Riesling is it's the opposite of Riesling acid. Riesling acid with this much sugar would be like high acid. So that's not. Okay, Muscat. Muscat has orange blossom, neroli, has the color. Muscat is a little grapey. Even a little bit more acid than this. Maybe not as floral, more like blossom. And then what about the reason it's Gewürztraminer, which is what it is because the acid is low. It's a very polarizing wine because some people think it's too flabby or flat, doesn't have enough acid. But I would argue that with the right foods, this wine is incredible. Okay, we're gonna go and show you. Sorry, we're drinking Albert Mann Gewürztraminer, which is Von der Alsace. So Alsace is the region. 2019, so it was
Much more expensive, yeah.
all in limestone soils, 35-year-old vines. Retails about $30. Any questions on this wine? How can you tell the difference between Gewürz and Torrontés? I'm so glad you asked. Okay, let's talk about that. Torrontés, Charles, is a New World wine, number one, okay? And Gewürztraminer is generally, when used in a blind tasting, Old World. With that said, you could get Gewürztraminer from California, and then they would both be Old World, or sorry, both be New World. So, so number one, Torrontés is actually, as we remember, a grape that descended from the Muscat grape. So for me, it has a grapey quality, just like Muscat. It can be floral like this, but maybe not as floral. It definitely does not have the minerality, but for me, the most important thing about Torrontés is it tastes slightly candy.
So
So when I get Torrontés, I get like almost like a synthetic or a fake, like candied quality, which this is syrupy but not candied, you know? So the acid on Torrontés is a little higher. The alcohol is not as high. And Torrontés generally grows in a high elevation, so you'll find it slightly more acidic, but not as high in alcohol like this. Does that make sense? But those two always should be put together in your final conclusion. I think that this is an extremely aromatic grape. I'm in between Old World and New World. I'm thinking Gewürztraminer from Alsace or Torrontés from Argentina. And then you go and you gut check and you say, there's just way too much minerals. I don't think that really would find that in Torrontés. Then you would go, the acid is just too low. Normally in Torrontés, I would get higher acid. The alcohol is just too high. Normally in Torrontés, I don't get this high alcohol. But it's such an important conversation because you would actually want to have it more about grape first and go through those two, then before you call Old World, New World. So there are some times where I would argue that you should always go and call Old World, New World first and then decipher grapes. There are other times when you want to work through the grapes and then go and make your Old World, New World call. And I think in this case, that's what I would have done. I would have said, I have two options, Gewürztraminer and Torrontés. And if it was more candied and if it didn't have as much alcohol, then I would absolutely be in Torrontés. So I'm so glad you asked. Okay, are there any questions on these wines or these characteristics of floral and pyrazine and anything about intensity? We talked a lot about fruit, ripeness. What I loved about this class is that we got the idea that we could have exotic tropical fruit on the nose, but not get it on the palate. That is a very important thing because that can confuse you for climates, but it wasn't about the climate. It was about the thiols. So remember that some characteristics in one wine could confuse you for another. So when we start to piecemeal it all together, one thing does not make the wine the conclusion. You have to have multiple reasons for calling a conclusion in a wine. So I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you have a great night. We'll send along the presentation and the recording tomorrow, and we'll
I
see.
do have one question, Laura, and it's not related to lesson. I guess more about like, I'm really interested in food pairings, and I kind of regret not asking that like the last couple of classes. But like for you with these wines, what would you kind of recommend to pair it with?
Love that, and I'm glad, and I'll start including that in my discussion because it is important. So for these wines, they're extreme, so I think we need extreme and bold flavors, number one. I always say when you're doing food and wine, it's like, what is the champion of the dish or what is the champion of the wine? So if you had to sum up these wines to people that could not taste or smell, with wine number one, you would say it's exotic. It has a lot of citrus, but it's explosive, it's aromatic, and it finishes tart, and it has this, a little bit of kiss of oak. So, I think about things like ceviche, mango, papaya, salsas, things that are maybe a little like Latin influenced food. So for me, I would get like a medium whitefish. I would make a mango salsa. I would put some onions and jalapeno in the salsa, and I would just have taco night with wine number one, and I'd be super pleased, especially if I had some aromatics, like tropical fruits. For the Gewürztraminer, people love Gewürz because it has a little bit of residual sugar with spice,
Okay.
and especially with curry, because there are very few wines that are not oaked, but can give you texture, and can cut through spice. So I'd probably make like a chicken vegetable curry with coconut milk and put a little spice like the green curry or the massaman curry with this. I've had really great like this Gewürztraminer, not that any of us are eating frog's legs at home, but they go well with like young garlic. Sometimes if you have foie gras or pate, like a foie pate or terrine of foie with a Gewürztraminer, I often find these wines, they taste better with food, especially with spice. So anything that you would cook with ginger would be great with this wine. It will really bring out the ginger quality. So those are my top. And then when we were talking about previous classes, we had that unbelievable Cornas, that Syrah from the Rhone Valley. And I just think more people should drink Syrah in steakhouses. You will save so much money if you skip the Cabernet section in a steakhouse where they mark it up 3 times, especially charred black and blue steak, especially a poivre steak, lamb and something like peppery, like if I had lamb chops and I just wanted to make like a Mediterranean lamb dish, lamb, olive oil, or sorry, lamb, olives, black peppercorn. That Syrah was made for that kind of thing. Also, eggplant is really good with that Syrah. So sometimes I make like my famous eggplant parm, and you have a smoky thing like in a vegetable like eggplant with Syrah. It's delicious. That Gruner Veltliner we were all talking about that wine with vegetables, but I think also with like a caraway sesame, so sesame chicken, things that are nutty. So a lot of times you'll have like a fluke or brown butter fluke with Gruner Veltliner can be really nice. Pork schnitzel, things that are like slightly fried, cutlets, things like that. It's really good with Gruner, especially if you have sesame oil that you can use in cooking. So that's probably the Gruner and Syrah. And then I remember we had that cab from Napa, but a lot of it was a blend from Spring Mountain. And then the white that week, what was the white? The first,
Oh, that was the Australian Riesling, I think.
Yeah.
The tennis ball Riesling.
Riesling. A lot of people like, when I visited Australia, you would drink Riesling with oysters, so especially with raw bar, but shrimp cocktail and that Riesling would be perfect. It's kind of like candied lime, lemon. So I like Clare Valley Riesling with crudo, raw fish, things like that. And then, yeah, that Cab Merlot, I mean, it really begs for like some sort of braised, short rib would be perfect. The texture would be perfect with like a braised short rib, especially with root vegetables. Something that had a tomato base with, you could make like a tomato based braise with, that would be good with that. So I'm glad you brought that up, MJ, because
Laura, if I can make a small point, for those who hate gourds the way I do, for curry, I think for a lot of curries, I think Moselle Riesling or Gruner even or roses go way better. But for some people really like gourds, but then I think if you don't, I think Rieslings go so much better, especially Moselle Rieslings or Gruners. I just wanted to point because we eat a lot of curry at home and gourds just doesn't do it for us. So anyway.
well, definitely you're absolutely right. One of the first things about food and wine, you have to actually like the wine.
Yes.
No matter what, you're gonna especially hate it if you love your food. So you're right. I do think that you can do opposite too. You might want, especially if you love spice, you don't want something like a birch. You want something like a Riesling with a lot of acid.
Yeah, I mean, people tell me really well-aged gourds is a different animal and very different and very exciting, but I've never had it. It just doesn't work for me, but thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a great day. I will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.